Hi, I'm Dean Walker, and you are now watching the third in a series of videos that are meant to condense and offer up an introduction to the work of Dr. Iain McGilchrist. He's a research psychiatrist in the UK, and he has really given over the majority of his adult working life to researching the dynamics of the hemispheres of our brain. And apart from the pop psych left hemisphere, right hemisphere stuff that we may have heard of from back in the 70s and so on, which this is not that. He makes abundantly clear. Um, what I've what I've been really attracted to in here in Living Resilience as we've been putting together coursework and resources to help make sense of these absolutely insane self-terminating times in human history. What we are going to be doing here in the third episode of this series is we're going to be following up what started out with Daniel Schmachtenberger, giving us a little hint about how important Iain McGilchrist's work would be to be able to seriously look at and make sense of how we have created this self-terminating system. So in that first one, it was a kind of a mixture of some of the distinctions that Daniel Schmachtenberger has brought forth in his now years of working extensively on sense making in these times. And so that was the first one. And there were a few distinctions there offered there about left hemisphere dynamics and attributes, right hemisphere dynamics and attributes, just kind of getting us ready for the conversation. The second episode, which hopefully you're watching these in order, it doesn't have to happen in order, but hopefully you're able to watch them all one way or another. That second one is really going into depth. It was excerpted from a conversation that Iain McGilchrist had with podcaster Nate Hagens, who's doing extensive work on the more of the energy consumption and economics side of looking at, well, he doesn't actually call it collapse, but the troubled times we're in, however it is that he couches it. So that was far more in depth about some more of the dynamics of each of the hemispheres and some more of the distinctions between the two and some more of the dynamics of how this isn't about one hemisphere is bad and wrong and we should get rid of it and the other one's super good and that's all we should have. It's not, he never says that. He makes a point of saying that we do need both. But up till now, what's gotten us into this self-terminating dead end is that the left hemisphere, the hemisphere that really has all the attributes, you could just literally list them off, of an executive in a corporation or a government official in these times, in how they would see the world and how they interact with the world and what's the main focus and the purpose that they express in the world, what got them into that position, why are they honored with that position. And those are all the attributes, for the most part, of the left hemisphere. And because they're out of balance, because they are running the show, they are the ones in charge, that leaves us at a severe deficit of what should be running the show is the right hemisphere elements that include context and relationship and metaphor and what he likes to call the implicit, and I have adopted that from him. It really works in my own experience and my practices, and then the practices that we offer here in the work of Living Resilience, the inner work here in Living Resilience, because all of this implies There's inner work we can do at an individual level, and we can see it expressed, see the imbalance expressed in our world at large. Your guess is as good as mine if anybody will ever come up with a way to impact the world at large where we can bring ourselves back to an appropriate balance in which we are actually running the world with the right hemisphere in charge. In McGilchrist's earliest work, he has two massive books, and the earliest one is The Master and His Emissary. If we can get the master back in that primary position, that right hemisphere, the one that has the ability to see in context, see in relationship, and so on, that would not eliminate the left hemisphere. It is not bad and wrong. It's just out of control and in a power position that it is incapable of doing anything other than creating a self-terminating system. So that's where we find ourselves here. This episode is going to talk to you about some of the dynamics that were just mentioned in the last episode. One is the Dunning-Kruger effect, and that is one of the aspects of the left hemisphere now in charge, now taking us down a dead-end alley, and how some of the dynamics are really odd, but they're so visible in our world. It's extraordinary. And some of those aspects are that the left hemisphere has no use for the right hemisphere. Once it gets off the leash, which it clearly is, it has no use for and no appreciation for the right hemisphere. So it dominates and suppresses the right hemisphere. It also has kind of a rough habit of thinking that it is far more capable, far more intelligent, far more able to lead in an extraordinary way than it actually has the ability to do. It thinks very, very highly of itself and thinks very, very corrosively, not just negatively, but corrosively about anyone beneath it, which is everybody, but primarily for this dynamic, for this conversation. It's tends to act that way, toward the right hemisphere. So you're going to hear about the Dunning-Kruger effect, and I'd ask that you listen carefully on an individual level to see if there are any of those traits in yourself. I'm certainly know that I have some of that. And why I'm so free in asking that of us all is that really, are you as clear as I am that we are all saturated in this business as usual world, this left hemisphere dominated world, this self-terminating structure? So hopefully you're as aware, painfully aware as I am, that we all are. And so one way we can start to desaturate is to really be self-exploring, to hopefully sit in circle with people who can support us in this kind of exploration, and we can all look together. How do we have some of that shadow stuff going inside ourselves, some of that self-terminating arrogance that is the Dunning-Kruger effect? So that's one. We're also going to be seeing a brief video clip that is about some of the split brain research that Iain McGilchrist goes into extraordinary detail in his 4 volumes of 2 books, 4,000 pages. No, excuse me, I believe it's closer to 2,000 pages in his 2 books. But he speaks about it rarely because it's medical and it's technical and so on, but he does go into detail in his books if you want a deep dive, and in some of his YouTube videos. In this brief video, you'll get a sense of at least one of those, a couple of those cases where people have had the corpus callosum, the middle ground between the two hemispheres, cut. And so that really brings it to bold contrast how one eye is connected to the other hemisphere, the other eye, obviously, the other hemisphere. And those dynamics start to be able to be something we can see more readily, and we can start to see how our brains have no choice but to distort and rearrange information as it comes in order to fit the parameters that we've got set up in our own brain, including the dynamics of the hemispheres. I hope you find it, as fascinating as I have. It's a very potent addition to specifically Iain McGilchrist's work. It's not this second video is not Iain McGilchrist. He's not even mentioned in it, but the work is so parallel. So I hope you're going to find this useful. We're getting toward the end of the series. I think it might go to 4 or 5 videos. And so far, really, if you had to stop at what you've already gotten in the first 2, you've got enough to get going. So I hope you're going to continue on with either the sense-making course or the introductory course, whichever one or both that you're engaged with. And that introductory course is called Collateral Beauty. It's so helpful to have the McGilchrist work to help us make sense of these profound feelings that we're going to go through as we go through, mostly I'm thinking the Collateral Beauty introductory course, and also to make sense of these profound elements that we are facing, all of us, including how it is that we can be creating this self-terminating system and not slowing down one iota after knowing about our damage to our habitat for more than 4 decades now. These are extraordinarily core questions. And again, I find that McGilchrist's work helps me to not only make sense of, but find some context for one of the other core questions that I carry quite often, which is humanity evil? Are we a self-terminating species? I don't know. These are far bigger questions than I think any one human being can answer. But unfortunately, we all have the opportunity to look at this level of question from now on. So I hope you, again, find this series valuable for either your preparation for sense-making or for Collateral Beauty. Welcome again to Living Resilience and all the stuff we do. And I hope to meet up with you in a course or a support group session sometime soon. Thanks.
Socrates said the only true wisdom is knowing when you know nothing. But that's not actually easy for humans to do because our brains want us to think that we are awesome. In 1995, MacArthur Wheeler walked into a bank in Pittsburgh ready to rob it. He didn't wear a mask, he didn't have like a fake mustache, he was just there robbing a bank in full view of everyone. He even smiled at the security cameras before leaving and going to a second bank to rob that one too. Later that night, the security footage allowed the police to pick him up and take him off to jail, which shocked him. He was shook. "I wore the juice," he famously exclaimed. Wheeler believed that rubbing lemon juice on his skin would render him invisible to videotape cameras. This is a cognitive bias at work, and it inspired 2 psychologists to create some experiments to understand it better. Cognitive biases are everywhere. Have you ever met someone who has one, like perhaps during a group project at school or during an argument with a stubborn uncle or when you had to toil alongside that coworker? You know the one I'm talking about. Somebody who believed they knew things but really they didn't. Believing you know something you don't is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's named for the two psychologists who, upon hearing about Wheeler's bank robberies, formulated a set of experiments to determine if Wheeler's juice beliefs were due to some kind of cognitive bias. Cognitive biases allow us to convince ourselves that something is true, even if the reality is different. Cognitive biases protect us from reality. They let us process information more quickly and they help us make decisions more quickly, but that doesn't mean that they are good. Cognitive biases are essentially a subjective social reality. The Dunning-Kruger effect is, in a nutshell, a way for everyone to feel good and above average internally, because most of us are actually completely average. Dunning-Kruger can help explain why people feel that they're experts even though they know very little about something, a problem sometimes described by this graph. The vertical axis is confidence, and the horizontal is experience. Imagine someone spent an hour reading the Wikipedia page about global warming, then took to Twitter to try and school some climate scientists who have literally spent their lives studying it. You don't have to imagine this, because you know it. It happens all the time. This cognitive bias is extremely common. For example, a 1992 survey of the engineers at one company found that 42% of them, 42%, believed they were in the top 5% of all the engineers at the company. But that's not actually possible. 42 cannot be 5. Another example is driving. One study found most people believe that they are above average at driving. But most people cannot be above the average. Another survey of people aged 77 years and older jived with that as well, most assuming they were average or above average. But again, that's not actually possible. Most people have to be average because that's how statistics work. The psychologists who first realized this bias was part of the human fabric did so in 4 studies: humor, logic and reasoning, and English grammar. We'll just take one. In the humor study, the psychologists asked 2 groups to rank jokes on a scale of 1 to 11, 1 being not at all funny and 11 being very funny. Group A was a set of average Cornell undergraduates, and Group B was a small set of professional comedians. The idea was to see if average people would believe that they were above average at picking out what was funny, or as good as professionals. After Group A had ranked the jokes, the researchers asked them to compare their ability to pick what was funny against the professional comedians, to rate themselves. And unsurprisingly, on average, everyone overrated their skills. Remember, 50 is average, and the whole group together said that they did 66, which I would rank as an 8 out of 11 on our joke scale. But this is where the surprise comes in. Those who did the worst placed themselves in the 58th percentile on average. They believed that they were better than 57 other people out of 100. Their real score? The 12th percentile. They were worse than 88 other people. These were the victims of this newly discovered cognitive bias, the idea that people with a little bit of knowledge or skill in an area believe that they are better than they are. Dunning and Kruger went on to show that this bias exists multiple times with different experiments, like when assessing effective leadership, raising children, constructing a solid logical argument, and so on. Generally, in each study, the participants in the bottom 25% of scores consistently ranked themselves in the 70th percentile. It is worth pointing out that self-confidence is extremely important. Self-esteem is valuable. We should all feel good about ourselves. That said, we should also have a good assessment of what we're good at and what we are not good at. For example, I'm pretty good at making science videos. I am not very good at kung fu, farming, or financial policy. It's easy to dismiss Dunning-Kruger as just overinflated ego, but that's not actually what's happening. Even ego can see its own limits, and there are some serious examples of people not even realizing their own failures thanks to this bias. These experiments work not just in humor, logical reasoning, and rules of grammar, but also have been replicated in math skills, wine tasting, chess, firearm safety among hunters, and medical knowledge among surgeons. And that's where things get really serious. A 74-year-old woman awoke from a simple spinal fusion surgery in terrible pain because her surgeon believed himself to be one of the best around. Instead, he's now in prison for life. He's accused of maiming multiple patients and causing 2 deaths. Meanwhile, he claimed, quote, everybody's doing it wrong, and that he was, quote, the best in the whole state. It's pretty amazing that it took us so long to give Dunning-Kruger a name because it is everywhere. The more we look for it, the more we see it. That said, Dunning-Kruger doesn't apply to everything, namely in areas where it's easy to compare. Baking, for example. If you assume you're an amazing baker, then you bake a cake and it's inedible, it's pretty hard to deny that you're a terrible baker. One paper I read said that most people who play golf don't believe that they are as good as Tiger Woods when surveyed, but I would guess if we asked, they would still rate themselves above average. Because an online survey of over 1,700 average adults in Great Britain found that 1 in 8 men believed that they could score a point against Serena Williams, the woman ranked #1 in tennis for more than 6 years. That said, it's very important to point out the Dunning-Kruger effect is gender neutral. It applies to us all. Interestingly though, Dunning-Kruger found the people at the top don't overestimate themselves. In fact, quite the opposite. Dunning-Kruger found the best around tend to rank themselves below their actual performance. Yeah, DK has 2 parts. People in the bottom 25% rank themselves at near the top, and people in the top 25 tend to rank themselves a bit lower than their actual score. This can help us understand why it is hard to counter Dunning-Kruger. In order to know you don't know anything, you gotta have to know something. An example, if your cognitive bias has you assume that you're amazing at driving, but you only drive in, say, rural areas of the desert Southwest, how would you ever find out that you're bad at it? You would need to drive around others or take classes to learn good driving habits or ride with someone who is objectively considered a good driver to see what you're doing wrong and then get that critique and recognize it and then learn. You think many of those people who believe they're good drivers are going to do those things? Yeah, I didn't think so either. In a bit of follow-up research, Dunning has found people who are low performers in reality are not good at accepting criticism and often don't show interest in self-improvement. He told Forbes, quote, research subjects were willing to criticize their own previous poor skills once they were trained up and could see the difference between their previous poor performance and their new and improved performance. But to get them to train up on their own was very unlikely. If we never change the knowledge that we assume we have, then we can just keep on going thinking we're amazing. Who doesn't want to do that? Even if we're not. Yay, cognitive biases. In the end, Dunning-Kruger is a cognitive bias that can affect anyone and everyone. If you're actually above average at any task, you might be undervaluing yourself. And if you're average or below average at some other tasks, you're probably assuming you're pretty good. In the age of the internet, everyone can be a quote-unquote expert. We all have access to infinite information. Our minds are drawn to learn a little bit about a lot of things. And that little bit of information is enough to make us weak-minded humans feel confident about what we know, even when we know nothing. And add to that the global platforms of social media, and then everyone can feel like an expert, and most won't accept any critique. Let's face it, I have probably been one of those people, and maybe you have too. It's crucial in today's overstimulated world to be able to differentiate a real expert from an overconfident novice. And that goes for understanding your value as well. The key is know your talent, understand your pitfalls, take criticism, and keep on learning. Way back in 1871, long before we knew what Dunning-Kruger was, Charles Darwin wrote, "Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge." And it turns out he was right. I wonder if Darwin would have rated himself as being above average on that one.
In 1939, doctors began splitting living human brains in half in order to treat severe forms of epilepsy. If that wasn't weird enough, no one was prepared for what happened next. The surgeries didn't only cure the patient's epilepsy, but fundamentally upended our understanding of human consciousness. In fact, many neuroscientists point to the experiments that came after these surgeries as evidence that there's not just one you living inside your brain, but potentially dozens or hundreds of different yous always competing for control of your body. Now, that may sound, well, frankly insane, but before you flip to the next video in your queue, there's someone that I want you to meet. This is Joe. 7 years before this was shot for Scientific American Frontiers, surgeons cut the corpus callosum that connects the two sides of his brain.
I know Our left hemisphere and right hemisphere now are working independent of each other, but...
The corpus callosum is the brain's information superhighway. It transfers an immense amount of information every second and unifies the brain into a single, coherent structure. In most cases, this is exactly what we want to happen. But when Joe had epileptic seizures, a rumble that began on one side of the brain could quickly travel through his entire brain over the corpus callosum and result in a dangerous condition called a grand mal seizure. Severing it made his symptoms much better. But more importantly, for our purposes today, it also gave scientists a unique opportunity to study how the two halves of a human brain operate independently from one another. It was time to experiment. The brain's unique wiring means that each eye connects directly to the opposite hemisphere. So the left eye sends images to the right side and vice versa for the right eye to the left hemisphere. This means that it's possible to send visual information to one hemisphere at a time. And when the corpus callosum has been cut in two, that the half brain must process that information all on its own. For reasons locked in our evolutionary past, the left hemisphere here contains the language center and thus connects to the right eye, while both sides share the motor cortex, left hand, right side, and right side, left hand. This means that if you show a picture to the left hemisphere, it can respond with words, while the right hemisphere can only communicate with gestures and with writing. The researchers wanted to know what would happen when one half of a person's brain got different information about the world around it than the other half. How would each side integrate its knowledge of the environment when the other half disagreed about what was going on? In a novel experiment, Michael Gazzaniga, a neuroscientist, showed Joe a computer screen that displayed a handsaw on the left side of the screen and a hammer on the other. And the neuroscientist asked him what he saw. Since his language cortex could only communicate about the right side of the screen because things were sort of like partitioned off, he responded that he saw a hammer.
What did you see?
Saw a hammer.
Then, when they asked the other side of his brain what appeared on the screen, his left hand, and thus his right hemisphere here, drew this: a handsaw. When asked why Joe drew the handsaw, the other side of his brain that controlled the language center said this.
That's nice. What's that? Saw? Yeah. What'd you see? Hammer?
This moment is super important. When we talk with our mouths, the assumption is that we are speaking with our own full and unified conscious selves. To an outsider, Joe seems completely sincere in his words, and yet he's simultaneously in disagreement with his hands. There are two Joes in Joe. In a similar experiment from the 1960s, the neuroscientist Robert Sperry presented the image of a bell to a half-brained patient, or to a split-brained patient, and then asked the language-holding side of the brain why it drew that bell in the first place. The patient explained that he must have seen a bell on the way to the lab that day. In other words, the language-using side of the man's brain decided to make up a story about the unfamiliar picture rather than admit that the brain was having two separate experiences at the same time. This experiment has been repeated on dozens of people with split brains over the years, and it's always the same. It leads to the seemingly impossible conclusion that the human brain isn't one integrated, complete self, Rather, it's multiple potential selves depending on how much of the brain is active at one particular moment. Yet on a daily basis, the surgery didn't really change Joe's life all that much.
You don't notice it. Now, you just kind of adapt to it. You don't have any feeling, it doesn't feel any different than it did before.
Despite the two sides seeing, experiencing, and reasoning in somewhat independent ways, there's a neurological step in human consciousness that then recombines disparate data into a sense of a unified self. To me, this is evidence that our natural unified self is an illusion that our brain invents to make it easier for us to navigate the world. The data suggest that, at a minimum, there are as many potential selves inside our minds as there are discrete and autonomous sections of the brain to process experience about the world. And if you thought that wasn't far out enough, maybe this is all just the tip of the iceberg. Perhaps consciousness writ large isn't really a thing that exists in any one place at all. Maybe we can only understand it as an activity that exists between things in the synapse, between different cells, organ systems, organisms, individuals, and even ecosystems writ large. In my book, The Wedge, I write that the relationship between our bodies and the environment is eerily similar to the experiments on split brains. Who we are at any one moment depends on the accumulation and processing of all our previous experiences. Who would any of us be without our childhoods or education, first loves and triumphs, and crushing defeats? All of those things shape our personalities at the same time that they change our biologies. We respond with hormonal signals and neurotransmitter releases. These are physical processes. And the same process goes on inside the cells of our own body. Now, if I'm anxious all of the time, I'm going to be dumping adrenaline and cortisol into my bloodstream, into my cells, and all of those things experience whatever is happening outside the body as a bath of these hormones. Alternately, if I'm lying on a beach, relaxing, the hormones and secretions that my immune system experiences are altogether more oriented towards resting. For them, I'm a lens onto the outside world that they can never directly connect to. Now, on the other hand, what happens in my body also has an effect on my own personality. As anyone with a leaky gut or chronic anxiety can attest, the action of those cells can radically alter a person's mood for the better or for the worse. There's a constant feedback loop between our inner worlds and our outer worlds. In The Wedge, I write that I am part of a great living ecosystem that works on scales as large as tectonic shifts, but also at the infinitesimally small level of the microorganisms inhabiting my gut and the autonomous cells of my immune system. I live in an ecosystem at the same time that I am an ecosystem. And everything together is part of the great superorganism of life itself. This doesn't seem intuitive, but in my opinion, our unique perspectives on the world are really just one link in a continuous chain of subjective experience between the very smallest molecules in our bodies and the universe itself. Consciousness is mostly just context. These split brain experiments prove this point at an anatomical level. Who we are is not who we think we are. We have a perception that our whole brain somehow adds up to the experience of a self. And yet, when you start parsing out how information in different parts of the brain reacts to the environment, the illusion comes crushing down. Experience is only a container for context. Maybe consciousness is merely the experience of different contexts happening. As Alan Watts once said, you are the universe becoming aware of itself. At first, this realization can be alienating. It doesn't feel intuitive at all because we are predisposed to think that who we are originates from the unique perspective of our bodies. We point to our heads and tell you that somehow I'm in here. I'm in this head somewhere. But am I really? I'm only here insofar as what it feels like to be me. Meanwhile, just like a split brain, you viewer, have an entirely different experience of me than I do. Right now, as you watch this video, I am changing the way that your brain organizes data. Whether you like it or not, merely experiencing my voice alters the way that your neurons fire, and it creates an imprint of me in your physical tissue. That is to say, because you watched this video, there is a little bit of me in you right now. Yeah, that's super creepy, but it's also the way consciousness works. If you comment on this video down below and I read it, you will have reached through the wiring of the internet and altered my own sense of self. That's because we are all connected. We're all working on this great project of consciousness together. That's how our brains work, and that's how, well, everything works all at once. So what starts as research on brains that have been cut into pieces shows us how, in reality, we're all one. Split brain research continues to march forward, and all of the most recent papers indicate how much more still needs to be done. Questions still abound about whether or not divided brains have a way of communicating between the hemispheres or through other pathways. And for that matter, what experience really is at all on a neurological level. Ultimately, answering some of those more thorny questions might require entirely new scientific approaches altogether. So, thank you so much for coming with me through this video. If you've had an opportunity to read my book, The Wedge, you'll know how we can use this knowledge of a unified consciousness to alter the way our internal biology works on a very real level. We can use it to build resilience and even communicate with the activities of our immune system inside. If you'd like to know more about how our unified consciousness could theoretically reach all the way back to the origins of the universe itself, check out this video I made about what happens when we die. Or, perhaps this slightly longer video where I talk about how we can use our sensory system to insert a wedge between consciousness and biology. Thank you so much for being here, and I really appreciate it, and there is so much more to come. See you soon.